What is the relationship between a 40% increase in the money supply, $30 trillion in federal debt, and rising prices? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, free markets, private property, limited government. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, former Ludwig von Mises professor of economics at the at Hillsdale College. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you, and it's great to be with our viewers and listeners once more.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to FFF, as I say every week, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe for free to our FFF Daily, which we've been publishing now for more than 20 years. Best libertarian commentary page on the internet. And subscribe, of course, to the YouTube channel. We've got a monthly journal that's great called Future of Freedom. So we'd love to have you join us and become a supporter, a financial supporter of FFF. So, Richard, the national debt that you and I have been talking about for the 32 years that FFF has been in existence has now reached $30 trillion, which is absolutely incredible and growing. This is of course, is the debt that the federal government owes. And if they're going to pay off that debt, that means they tax taxpayers to pay it off. At the same time, we've seen a massive growth in the money supply. As I understand it, 40% increase in just the past couple of years, which to me sounds like an incredible increase, an incredible inflation. And we've seen that inflation already manifesting itself in rising prices. Gosh, I recently filled up my 4Runner, which used to cost me just $40 or so to fill up, and now it went over $60. And we've seen the prices at the grocery store. And so, of course, this takes into consideration all those stimulus funds. Remember when we were arguing that this is not free money, that they're just printing the money to do this, which obviously is the case, and that people are going to have to pay the price in terms of debased currency. So if somebody doesn't get a raise at work, they have actually suffered a diminution in their standard of living because their money is buying less. So those stimulus checks didn't turn out to be free after all, which is what we said at the time, that they end up costing people money, and especially people on fixed incomes. I mean, that's who in the inflation has always hurt. And we're seeing the same syndrome now, that the government has nothing to do with the rising prices, that it's just a reflection of greedy profiteers and bourgeois swine, capitalists and service station owners and so forth. Same old syndrome that we see whenever we've seen this inflationary debauchery of the currency, which has been taking place since 1913 when the Federal Reserve was established. So there's this integration that takes place between rising government spending. They don't want to overly tax people because they know that people don't like paying too much taxes. So they say, oh, well, we'll just start borrowing the money, and people won't notice any difference. They won't really think that they're on the hook for this money, even though taxpayers are on the hook for it. And then to enable us to continue doing this and not have to raise taxes, we'll just print the money up and pay off the debt with inflated dollars, which of course is hurting people on fixed incomes, as I said earlier. So it's a bad game they're playing here, and you and I have said for years that this is not going to end well, and I think they're just getting started, because if you see, nobody's willing to give up their part of this dole, this massive government spending that's taking place every year. Certainly Social Security recipients aren't willing to let go of their dole, Medicare recipients, farm subsidies, education grants, food stamps. Nobody's willing to let go of their dole. And then look at the military side of this. The national security establishment, they are going to fight tooth and nail for the continuation of their dole. We've already seen that. They get out of Afghanistan. They no longer have the expenditures, the massive expenditures associated with Afghanistan. Have they cut military spending to compensate for that? Of course not. They've actually increased it. So the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA are getting everything they were getting plus more when they were over there occupying Afghanistan and killing people and dropping bombs and using all kinds of weaponry and armaments and bullets and so forth. So we're on a trajectory, Richard. It seems to me that this is not going to end well. We can look at countries like Venezuela and Greece and Italy, where things have turned very, very bad. The statists keep saying, oh, no, the U.S. is a prosperous country. But every country has its limits, Richard. And at some point, they can put so much weight on the backs of the American people that starts to cave in on itself. To me, it's just not a question of if, it's a question of when. What's your take on all this?
Well, I think it's always useful, as I try to often do, to give an historical context to this. It took from around 1790 to 1980, almost 200 years, for the United States government to accumulate $1 trillion of debt. And during much of those earlier times, the debt was almost minute. In the 19th century, there was an unwritten fiscal constitution that said just as it is wise and judicious for an individual to manage his finances in such a way so as to keep his spending within the limits of his income, that is more or less to be following a balanced budget, there was an unwritten fiscal constitution that the same applied to the US. And if you look at the budgetary pattern of the federal government in the 19th century, there were times when the government ran budget deficits, usually connected with a wartime emergency, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the American Civil War, the Spanish-American War, though that one obviously was an extremely short one, and the First World War. In each of those times, there was a resort to the printing press and a rising debt to fund the government's needed expenditures. But also, if you look at such a pattern, you see that after each war crisis passed, the government ran budget surpluses. That is, it took in more revenues than it was choosing to expend on a year-to-year basis, so that cumulatively, as the years passed following the crisis, the debt decreased as a percentage of some measured amount back then of gross domestic product, of GDP. And that, in fact, at a few points, particularly in the mid-1830s, the US debt was reduced to virtually zero. That was during Andrew Jackson's time in the White House. But that pattern followed the same. Emergency spending with deficits followed by surpluses to pay it off when the crisis had passed. That ended with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Here was peacetime, and there was this huge resort to deficit spending to try to goose up the economy in an emerging Keynesian view of what was necessary to get an economy out of a recession and to keep it there. And then World War II came. And again, there was a massive amount of government borrowing to cover a significant portion of the wartime expenditures. And while in the 1950s and leading into the 60s, the percentage of the gross domestic product made up of the debt went down, just because the economy was growing faster than the debt was. The fact is that the deficits continued for virtually the entire post-war period, except for a few individual exceptional years here and there, with the result that it took, as I said, from 1790 to 1980 for the U.S. to cumulatively collect $1 trillion of debt. But then just between 1980 and the turn of the new century, the year 2000, 2001, the debt went from 1 trillion to 5 trillion. And that is the amount of national debt that existed when George W. Bush entered the White House. But then during his 8 years in the White House, which came to an end in January 2009, in that 8-year period, the national debt had grown from 5 trillion to 10 trillion, a doubling. And then in the 8 years that Obama was in the White House, the debt doubled again from 10 trillion to about 20 trillion. And then in just the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, the debt went from a little over $20 trillion to about $25 to $26 trillion. And now, just in less than one term of being in office, indeed, not even a full 2 years yet, the national debt under Joe Biden has now just crossed the threshold of $30 trillion. The debt has been increasing, excuse me, at an accelerating rate. Now, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office reports, and again, for those who may not be familiar with it, the Congressional Budget Office is a group of economists and statisticians who are meant to be the nonpartisan policy wonks hired by Congress, that is both parties, so it's supposed to be not biased. And they look at, well, what is the pattern of government expenditures likely to be in future years and decades, given the current tax law? And what is the pattern of expected government expenditures over the coming years and decades, given existing law for, let's say, entitlement programs, as they're called, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other related programs, and what is viewed as, quote, discretionary spending, such as defense spending. And the Congressional Budget Office has projected that not just over the next 10 years, but beyond that, in decades to the middle of the 21st century, the U.S. government is going to be running, running budget deficits of $1 trillion or more every year. So that in fact, looking between now and 2031, the national debt will probably in the next 10 years be over $40 trillion, if not more, and then even more going beyond that. Now, what is basically driving all of this, and you were alluding to this, Jacob, is the fact that we now exist in a situation where there is no unwritten, let alone a written fiscal constitution. The Constitution does not specify that the federal government needs to balance its budget. It can run a budget surplus, it can run a budget deficit. Unlike many state governments that have in their respective state constitutions balanced budget requirements. But since the 1930s and the rise of the New Deal and then Keynesian economics that said deficit spending is the way to keep the economy goosed up and prevent and overcome recessions, the spending is just out of control. Because why? Politicians are able to offer constituents for either promising if they put them in office or to be reelected, goodies, but goodies that seem to have no price tag on them. You can offer government spending on this program, that program, some new program, some addition to an existing program, but you don't have to say where the tax revenue is going to come from. Whose fiscal ox is going to have to be gored right now to cover that expense? And then it becomes very clear to the people who will be incurring those higher taxes, as well as all others in society, that there are costs to what the government does. Just like you and I go to the supermarket and we go down the aisle with our shopping cart, and we always have in the back of our mind that if I pick an extra can of corn off the shelf and put it in the cart, that's less that I have to spend then on either other food items or something else out of my regular budget, because there's a constraint of only being able to spend as much as your income permits. But there is no visible cost to either the taxpayers or the citizenry, because the government just promises with the pixie fairy land that it just will be taken care of because the government can borrow it. And the borrowing seems to be something far into the future. But the fact is that to give one indication of how out of control this is, Jacob, is that last year in 2021, the Congressional Budget Office did one of its projections for, well, what is going to be the federal government's budgetary situation over the next 10 years to 2031. And they extrapolated from current tax laws, current expenditures, that by the year 2031, the budget deficit for that year will be approximately over 5% of gross domestic product, just the deficit for that year. But what is significant is that half of what the government is anticipated to borrow in 2031, half of what it borrows will just be to pay the interest on all of the accumulated debt of the 40 trillion that is expected to be the debt burden at that time. So the government is going to be borrowing money to pay just the interest on previous borrowing. Now let's think of an individual did this. What if an individual maxed out all his credit cards and his income was not permitting him to even pay the minimum monthly installment payments on those credit cards? So he then gets another credit card, which he uses merely to pay the interest on the prior credit cards. And then that happens to that credit card. Well, surely we can see that is a fiscally unsustainable situation for any individual or household. It's known as living far beyond your means and facing financial bankruptcy. That is what the US government is going to find itself in if this is the path it continues to follow. Now, if you think of a little country like Greece from a few years ago, they got themselves into this fiscal craziness. But who helped them to have some band-aids to sort of cover their spending and debt embarrassment? The rest of the European Union countries, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, they all came in to try to ease the pain and make them follow a modest little austerity policy. But who's going to come to our aid? That is the United States government's aid. Oh, I forgot. Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn. I mean, who's going to bail us out? The fact is, there is no one. And if you're thinking about other countries, the Chinese government, that is the Chinese Communist government, already holds well over $1 trillion of American debt. Are we going to become more indebted to China? Are the Chinese going to be interested in taking more US debt, looking to these fiscally unsound years and decades of the future? No. So we are getting into a situation where, in spite of what may be said today, if you're not going to cut spending, if you're not going to raise taxes, and you find that you can't keep borrowing like this, then inevitably, if the government is going to follow its fiscal irresponsibility, it has only one other tool to fall back on. And that, as you were saying, is the monetary printing press, turning the crank of the handle. And it may all be computer money today, but it's still the same, cranking the metaphorical handle of the monetary printing press to cover the fiscal embarrassment of the government's borrowing, which, when the money percolates through the economy, ends up in all that money in our hands. And what do we do with all that money? We attempt to spend it. And don't be surprised if you then experience significant and increasingly worse price inflation.
Okay, would you comment on the expansion of the money supply point? Because I know you have insights on that, as to how much they've expanded and the significance of that.
Yes, the U.S. government has followed a pattern of, the central bank, our Federal Reserve System, has followed a pattern of monetary irresponsibility, for a very long time, but especially in this 21st century. Following both before the financial and housing crisis of 2008, 2009, the Federal Reserve had increased the money supply in the prior 5 years, 03 to 08, by almost 50% over a 5-year period. Then, in the 10 years following the the housing and banking crisis of 08, 09, the Federal Reserve continued to noticeably expand the money supply, again, almost doubling it. But now, with this coronavirus crisis and the situation where the economy was coming to a screeching halt in the first half of 2020 due to the government-mandated lockdowns, shutdowns, don't go to work, don't produce, don't go shopping, don't leave your home, except for those food and pharmaceutical needs that we've specified are essential, but immediately go back inside and keep that mask on, even when you're in the shower. So you never know. The fact is that the Federal Reserve then turned on the monetary spigot again to cover all of the expenses of the government, sending checks, propping up salaries, subsidizing businesses not to throw people off, formerly the payrolls, given the losses that were being suffered, so that in the last 2 years, approximately, and it depends on which of the monetary measurements you use, but in the last 2 years, the money supply has increased again by about 40%. This is monetary madness, monetary madness. And a lot of people said, oh, it doesn't matter because, well, look, the Federal Reserve is printing all of this money, but we don't see rising prices. But that's because all of these occur through time. The Austrian economists in particular, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich A. Hayek, Murray Rothbard, others who have emphasized the monetary aspects of inflation, have pointed out that the money is injected by the central bank in the form of loans, either to the government or others. The money then percolates out, passing from hand to hand, sector of the economy to sector of the economy, an increased demand here, a bit of a rising price there, passes to another hand with the rising prices of these goods and then those goods. And the cumulative effect is rising prices in a sort of differential, time-specific way. It all takes time. And now finally, the monetary chickens are beginning to come home to roost. And that is, we see significant price inflation due to all of the extra money that the Federal Reserve has created. And the fact is, if the Federal Reserve continues in this pattern, we will just see worse and worse price inflation. And in fact, even if the Federal Reserve would try to put on the monetary brakes, that itself will not bring a halt to the process because there's all the money they've already created that's going to keep percolating through the economy for a long period of time, generating rising prices, even if in principle the monetary printing press were to stop today.
Right, and if all those dollars that are overseas, that have been flowing overseas for decades, if they get the sense that their dollars are losing value, those $100 bills that all those drug dealers have in their walls of their houses and so forth, and start dumping those things, the process could actually accelerate in terms of the debasement of the currency.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Jacob, that obviously a lot of transactions are now computer-based transactions. We pay our bills online with a computerized transfer from our accounts to our creditors. We use our debit or our credit cards in going food shopping and so on and so forth. But we certainly still use cash dollars. Most of us have various amounts of those cash dollars in our wallets, and we use them still every day. But there are actually more of the cash dollars as a part of the total money supply of the United States. There are more cash dollars in the rest of the world than cash dollars in the United States. They've gone there through trade and investment rather than coming back to the United States. They've been used for, in some cases, illegal activities. Dollars are widely used for the buying and selling of goods and services abroad. All oil, well, not all anymore, but a good portion of oil transactions, crude oil transactions, are denominated in and occur through dollars. Then there's the fact that there are many parts of the world where people do not trust their own domestic currencies. So they've hoarded cash dollars. And some countries have even made the dollar its official currency. There is Liberia in West Africa. There is Panama in Central America. Ecuador and a number of other countries have toyed with the idea of having the US dollar as their official legal currency. And in those places in the world, it is not mostly electronic money, but it is actually cash dollars. So if all of those if all or even a large portion of those cash dollars were to flow back in the United States, let's get rid of them and spend them because they're depreciating value, as you're pointing out. That would accelerate the price inflation in the United States even more.
Right. I think it's worth pointing out that we've been talking about this for a long time. I mean, your great book that you've done for FFF that I highly recommend readers to get, Monetary Central Planning in the State. I mean, if you want an absolutely fantastic exposition of the problem we're facing, I highly advise you to buy Richard's book online or on Amazon. And then Richard, I don't know if you recall this, but in the very first issue of Future Freedom, which at that time was called Freedom Daily, that is on our website at ff.org, the title of your article, if I recall correctly, and I forget, sometime in 1990, was Hyperinflation Brazil. It may have been the very first issue, maybe the second or third issue.
Yes, I had recently made a trip to Brazil in 1989. I had been invited by a free market organization down there, Instituto Liberal, headquartered in Rio, to give a series of lectures. I was there for about 2, maybe even 3 weeks, um, traveling from city to city, the capital cities of various Brazilian states, not all of them, but a good number of them. And so I was witnessing their hyperinflation. At that time, they had a currency called the Cruzado. And the government of that time had gotten itself into the same bind of spending promises and commitments far in excess of tax revenues collected. Borrowing opportunities were limited. Foreign lenders were reluctant to keep lending to the Brazilian government. And the consequences, they dramatically resorted to the printing press. They were experiencing hyperinflation. Now, most economics textbooks define a hyperinflation as a situation in which prices in general and on average are rising at 50% or more per month. And in fact, that was the case in Brazil. They were rising far above 50% a month. If you went into a restaurant in Brazil, it was not uncommon to find that when you looked at the items inside the menu, they did not have a price next to them. Remember, this is a while back. So what they did is that they would type out um, uh, a price list, and this would be inserted as a loose page at the back of the menu to tell you what the prices were for items offered by them that day. And the reason they didn't want to print it up